The fluorescent lights in the sterile hospital room flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. The air inside Atlanta Memorial's IQ felt thick with tension. Officer Greg Matthews stood by the window, his hand gripping the cold steel of the observation glass. Beside him, his loyal K9 partner Zeus, a Belgian Malinois, was pressed against the glass, his amber eyes fixed on the motionless figure lying in the bed. Greg could barely breathe. Kate Larson, his partner for years, was unconscious, hooked up to numerous machines, the beeping monitors the only sound breaking the silence. Zeus had always been more than just a police dog to Greg. He was family. The bond between them was something few people would ever understand. But today, Zeus wasn't acting like his usual self. Greg had seen the dog react to danger before, but this was different. Zeus was on edge, his body stiff, his growl low but unmistakable. Greg crouched beside him, his hand resting on the dog's neck, trying to calm him. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "She'll be fine. She's in good hands." But the dog wasn't listening. Zeus's eyes never left the room. His growl deepened, vibrating through his chest, a warning Greg couldn't ignore. The dog's ears were pinned back against his head, a sure sign of his unease. Greg had learned to trust Zeus's instincts, especially after everything they had been through together. They'd been partners for 5 years, tracking down criminals, stopping dangerous situations, and even saving lives. Greg knew Zeus's warnings weren't to be taken lightly, but he couldn't understand what was wrong. Kate was just in the hospital recovering. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least nothing Greg could see. "What's wrong, boy?" Greg muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he watched the doctor, Dr. Thomas Lane, move about the room. The man had been in charge of Kate's care since she'd been brought in, and while Greg had no reason to question him, something about the way the doctor moved around Kate's bed seemed off. Dr. Lane adjusted Kate's IV line, his hands swift and precise. Yet every time the doctor entered the room, Zeus's growl grew louder. Greg tugged gently on the leash, pulling Zeus away from the glass. "Calm down, Zeus," he said, but the dog wasn't calming down. Instead, Zeus's eyes locked onto the doctor's every move. It wasn't just suspicion. It was something deeper, more urgent. Greg felt a chill creep up his spine. Was something wrong with Kate? Or was there something more going on here? As Zeus's growl continued to rumble low in his chest, Greg's mind raced. He remembered a moment from their last assignment. He and Kate had been at Atlanta International, investigating a drug smuggling operation. Zeus had been the first to pick up the scent, the sharp chemical smell of danger. Kate had trusted the dog's instincts, and together they had taken down the criminals behind the operation. Now, in this hospital room, Zeus was picking up a familiar scent again. But this time, it wasn't coming from Kate or anyone in the room. Greg's thoughts were interrupted as Dr. Lane leaned over Kate's bed, his face too close to her as he adjusted her IV line again. Zeus's body went rigid and his growl grew louder. "Hey!" Greg barked, pulling on the leash again, but Zeus wasn't moving. The dog's attention remained fixed on the doctor, unblinking. Something wasn't right. Greg's heart pounded as he stepped back, pulling out his phone. He sent a quick text to Nurse Emily Dawson, who had been helping with Kate's care. "Emily, is Dr. Lane okay? Something's off." He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Just then, Nurse Dawson appeared at the door, her eyes locking onto Zeus. "What's going on?" she asked, concern in her voice as she walked toward them. Greg glanced at her, then at Zeus, who was now barking sharply, his stance aggressive. It was a warning, a signal that something wasn't just off. It was dangerous. "He's never acted like this before," Greg said, his voice low but steady. "I don't know what it is, but he's picking up something. It's coming from the doctor. Every time Dr. Lane touches Kate's IV, her vitals drop. I'm telling you, something's wrong." Emily frowned, looking between Greg and Zeus. She'd worked with K9 officers before, and she knew how deeply their instincts were honed. Zeus wasn't just anxious. He was alert, focused, and protective. She had seen this behavior before, but never in a hospital setting. "Have you noticed any changes in Dr. Lane's behavior?" she asked, her voice softer now. Greg shook his head, his jaw tightening. No, not really, but he's been in and out of her room all night. Something's not right and Zeus knows it. Emily nodded. I'll keep an eye on him. If anything strange happens again, let me know. As she left the room, Greg's gaze returned to Zeus, whose amber eyes remained locked on the doctor. The room felt colder now, the air thick with suspicion. Greg knew his partner wasn't wrong. Whatever danger they had faced before was nothing compared to what they were about to uncover. The truth was out there, and Zeus had already found it. They just had to figure out what it was before it was too late. The hospital room, once filled with the hum of medical equipment, now felt suffocating as if the walls were closing in. Greg's mind raced, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. And Zeus, as always, was the only one who knew the way forward. Greg felt the unease settle deeper into his bones. The fluorescent lights above hummed, and the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. But it was Zeus's unsettling growl that consumed the space between them. The dog had always been in tune with his instincts, but today, his behavior was different. It wasn't the typical anxiety from being away from his handler or distress from being in a hospital environment. No, this was something far more dangerous, a protective instinct that had kept them both alive countless times in the past. Zeus's amber eyes never wavered from the door where Dr. Lane had just exited. His muscles were tight, his posture rigid as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Greg leaned down, his face level with the dog's, his voice a whisper. Easy, boy, he murmured, hoping his words would calm the dog, but Zeus was having none of it. His nostrils flared and his head tilted slightly to the side, eyes narrowing, as if trying to piece together something only he could sense. Greg couldn't help but feel the weight of Zeus's determination. He had always trusted the dog's instincts, but today something about the way Zeus reacted felt like a warning, one that Greg couldn't ignore. They had been through so much together. Each mission a new test of their bond. In those moments of danger, it was always Zeus who found the lead, who sniffed out the hidden threats and turned the tide in their favor. Today, though, it felt like the stakes were higher than ever. We need to figure this out, Greg thought to himself, glancing back at Kate's motionless form. Her condition had been critical since she arrived, and yet, despite the doctor's assurances, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just fighting for her life. She was caught in something much bigger. But what could that be? The dog's growl softened for a moment, and Greg took a deep breath. He knew he had to trust Zeus, but there was something else. The air felt heavy, and the hairs on the back of Greg's neck stood on end as if a storm was about to break. Greg reached for his phone again, quickly typing out a message to Nurse Emily Dawson. Stay close to Kate's room. I think something's happening. Dr. Lane isn't who he says he is. His thumb hovered over the send button, but he hesitated. Could he be overreacting? Was it just Zeus's heightened sense of awareness that had made him so tense? Or was there something more to this? He hit send and stood back, his eyes scanning the room again. It wasn't just the doctor's behavior. It was the way his presence affected Kate, how her vital signs fluctuated the moment Dr. Lane entered the room. Greg had seen a lot in his time on the force, but this felt like something sinister. Zeus's low growl cut through his thoughts. Greg turned sharply to see the dog's gaze locked on the hallway just outside the IQ door. Something was approaching. Someone. Greg moved swiftly to the door, peering out into the corridor. At first he saw nothing, just the usual bustle of hospital staff going about their business. But then, a figure caught his eye. It was Dr. Lane, walking quickly, but this time, there was something in his stride. Something too deliberate, too calculated. What is it, boy? Greg murmured, his hand instinctively reaching for Zeus's leash. The dog's body was taut with readiness, his eyes narrowing in on the doctor's every move. Greg moved cautiously toward the hallway, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He glanced back at Kate's room. She was still unconscious, and yet, the room felt more suffocating than before. The tension in the air was palpable. This is insane, Greg thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, but he couldn't prove it. Not yet. As he waited, Zeus's behavior became even more intense. The dog was fixated, his eyes following Dr. Lane's every movement as the man reached a small service door at the end of the hallway. Without warning, Zeus broke free from Greg's grip, pulling the leash out of his hand. "Zeus, no," Greg shouted, but the dog was already in motion. His powerful muscles carried him quickly down the hallway, ignoring Greg's calls. The hallway echoed with Zeus's claws clicking against the polished floor, and Greg had no choice but to sprint after him, heart racing. Something was happening, and it was happening fast. Dr. Lane, unaware of the impending danger, stepped through the service door. But as he did, he glanced over his shoulder. Greg couldn't see his face from where he stood, but the brief moment of eye contact was enough to send a chill down his spine. There was something cold in the doctor's eyes, something unsettling. And then, without warning, the door swung shut, trapping the doctor behind it. Zeus's barking was deafening now, a sharp, commanding sound that made Greg's blood run cold. It wasn't a bark of excitement or a warning for drugs. It was a protective bark, a signal that something was dangerously wrong. Greg reached the door just as Zeus lunged at it, his powerful paws striking against the steel as if trying to break it down. Greg slammed his palm against the door in frustration, but before he could act, a voice interrupted him. "Stop him," Nurse Emily Dawson shouted, rushing toward Greg. "What's going on?" "I think he's trying to tell us something," Greg said, his voice grim. "I think Dr. Lane is involved in something dangerous." As the urgency of the situation set in, Greg knew there was no time to waste. If Zeus's instincts were right, then the doctor wasn't just a healer. He was part of something much bigger, something that had its grip on Kate's life and possibly much more. "We need to find out what's going on," Greg muttered, his voice resolute. "And we need to do it fast." With Zeus still barking furiously, Greg turned to Emily, his eyes locked on hers. They had to get answers, and they had to get them before it was too late. Time was running out. The tension in the hospital was palpable as Greg and Nurse Emily rushed to the service elevator. Zeus, still on high alert, pulled at the leash, his muscles tensed with urgency. Greg's mind raced, but there was no time for questions. Dr. Lane was disappearing behind that door, and Greg had to stop him before it was too late. They reached the elevator just as the doors began to close, but Zeus was faster. With a burst of energy, the dog leapt forward, his powerful frame slipping through the narrow gap in the doors. Greg shouted, but it was too late. Zeus was inside, and Greg could hear the unmistakable sound of paws scraping against the smooth elevator floor. He was already in pursuit. "Zeus, wait!" Greg shouted, but the dog's instincts were in full command. Greg could feel the leash slip from his hand as he reached for the elevator button. His heart raced as the elevator doors began to close, but just before they shut completely, Greg dove forward. The gap was small, but with one last effort, he squeezed into the elevator, pushing past the doors just before they closed entirely. Inside, the elevator was dimly lit, the stale air heavy, with the smell of disinfectant. Zeus stood at the far end, his ears flattened against his head, eyes locked onto the figure of Dr. Lane, who was standing by the control panel. Greg took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, but he could feel the urgency in his chest, tightening. Dr. Lane wasn't looking at them. He was focused on something. Maybe he was aware of Zeus, maybe not. But he wasn't making any move to stop them. Greg's mind raced. What was the doctor up to? The tension in the confined space made his head spin. Every moment felt like it could be the last. Dr. Lane, however, was calm, almost too calm. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he met Greg's gaze. Greg didn't waste a second. He lunged at the doctor, grabbing him by the arm, but Dr. Lane twisted out of his grip with surprising strength. The elevator lurched as it began its descent, the numbers on the panel flashing quickly as the floors ticked by. "You shouldn't have done this," Greg growled, trying to keep his hold on the doctor. But Dr. Lane was already moving, sidestepping, Greg's grasp and positioning himself near the elevator's emergency stop button. The air between them grew charged with danger. "You don't know what you're dealing with, officer," Dr. Lane said, his voice smooth, as if he had nothing to fear. There was something in his tone that sent a shiver down Greg's spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he spoke, with a sense of inevitability. Greg's hand instinctively reached for his radio, but before he could speak, a sound echoed from the elevator shaft, a sharp metallic clanging. The elevator lurched again, and this time it didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to pick up speed, plunging down the shaft. Greg gritted his teeth, trying to keep his balance as the elevator hurtled downward. Zeus, however, was unbothered by the chaos. His instincts were sharp and his attention was focused entirely on Dr. Lane. As the elevator sped down, the dog growled louder, his stance low and his teeth bared. Greg could see the animal's muscles tensing for action. Dr. Lane, realizing that he had no way to escape, made a split-second decision. He lunged for the emergency button, but Zeus was faster. With a sharp bark, the dog sprang into action, his jaws closing around Dr. Lane's arm just as the doctor reached the panel. Greg didn't have time to process what was happening. With a yank, he pulled Dr. Lane back from the button, but the doctor fought fiercely, his body twisting and turning to break free. In the confined space of the elevator, it felt like a struggle between predator and prey, but Greg was determined. He wasn't about to let this man escape. "Get off me," Dr. Lane shouted, his voice thick with panic. Greg could see the fear in his eyes now, and it only made him more certain that they were on the right track. Dr. Lane wasn't just a doctor. He was hiding something that had everything to do with Kate's condition. But what? The elevator's speed continued to increase, and Greg realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't stopping. The dog's grip on Dr. Lane tightened, and Greg couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. Zeus had him now. But even as the doctor struggled, the sound of the elevator's descent grew louder, the mechanical groans filling the air. "Hold on, Zeus!" Greg shouted, grabbing the dog's leash and pulling him back for a moment. He had to figure out how to stop this madness. There was no telling what was at the bottom of the shaft, but Greg wasn't about to risk both his partner and his canine for a man like this. As the elevator neared the ground level, the final floor indicator blinked. The doors opened suddenly, revealing a dark, shadowy corridor. Greg pushed forward, dragging Dr. Lane behind him, while Zeus stayed at his side, still growling with relentless determination. The dog's eyes never left the man as they all stepped out of the elevator and into the unknown. Greg scanned the hallway, his instincts on high alert. He knew they were not alone. The lights flickered above them, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Dr. Lane looked desperate now, his breath ragged. He had nowhere to run, but Greg wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. "This ends now," Greg said, his voice low, filled with unwavering resolve. He tightened his grip on Dr. Lane's collar, forcing him to face the reality that his time had run out. And in that moment, as the echoes of the elevator's descent faded into the distance, Greg realized that this was only the beginning. The battle to uncover the truth had just begun, and he and Zeus would face whatever came next together. The sterile hallway felt like it was closing in on Greg and Zeus as they marched forward, Dr. Lane stumbling in front of them. The shadows of the hospital, now bathed in dim, flickering light, seemed to stretch endlessly as though the building itself was conspiring against them. Zeus, still alert and tense, kept his eyes locked on the man in front of him. Greg could feel the dog's unease, but there was no time to stop. Dr. Lane had led them to something bigger than they could have imagined, and now they had to finish what they'd started. They reached a set of heavy metal doors at the end of the hall. The sign above read, "Restricted Area." Greg knew instinctively that this was where things were going to get messy. His hand tightened around his radio, but before he could speak, the doors slid open with an eerie hiss. A gust of cold air hit them, and Greg's gut twisted. The hospital had always been a maze, but this forgotten corridor, felt like it was part of something much darker. Dr. Lane shot a glance at Greg, then at Zeus, his face contorting into a mask of fear. The doctor struggled against Greg's grip, trying to twist out of his hold, but Greg wasn't having it. "Where are you taking us?" Greg demanded, his voice harsh. But Dr. Lane didn't answer. He simply gritted his teeth and kept moving, forward, no longer trying to resist. Greg knew that there was something far worse waiting for them on the other side of that door. Zeus was beside them, His tail held rigid, his ears flat against his head. The dog's instincts were razor sharp, and he knew that whatever was behind those doors was not going to be good. Greg could feel the heat rising from the dog, his tension palpable in the air. As they crossed the threshold, the first thing Greg noticed was the stark contrast between this area and the rest of the hospital. The walls were made of bare concrete, the floors cold and unfinished. Flickering overhead, lights barely illuminated the corridor, casting long, unsettling shadows. Greg's heart skipped a beat as he realized that they were no longer in a hospital ward. They had entered a part of the building that had been deliberately hidden. Dr. Lane's eyes darted nervously as they walked, his steps quickening, but Greg held his grip firm. They passed several rooms, but Greg couldn't see what was inside. The smell of antiseptic and mildew mixed in the air, making it harder to breathe. "This is it," Dr. Lane muttered, barely audible, but Greg caught every word. The man stopped in front of a large metal door clearly reinforced. "This is where it all ends." He turned to Greg, his face pale, his eyes full of fear. "You have no idea what you're getting into, officer. You think this is about drugs? About smuggling? This goes deeper than that." Greg didn't flinch. He had heard enough threats in his years on the force to last a lifetime, but there was something about the way Dr. Lane spoke, the underlying terror in his voice that made Greg stop for just a second. He had seen fear before, but this was different. "Open it," Greg commanded. He wasn't asking anymore. Dr. Lane hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for a keypad beside the door. There was a soft click, followed by the sound of locks releasing. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a large room beyond, filled with rows of metal shelves, each stacked high with crates. Greg's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. It wasn't what he expected. This wasn't a warehouse for pharmaceuticals or illegal substances. It was far more disturbing. On the far side of the room, illuminated by a single overhead light, Greg saw several tables lined with laboratory equipment. Vials, syringes, and chemical containers were scattered across the counters. But it wasn't the equipment that caught his eye. It was the symbols on the crates. Symbols that, in an instant, sent a chill down Greg's spine. They were familiar. He had seen them before in an investigation he and Kate had worked on months ago. These weren't just ordinary shipping labels. They were linked to a secretive network of military contractors, the same ones responsible for trafficking dangerous and illegal materials. This is where they were making it. Dr. Lane whispered, his voice trembling. The drugs, the weapons, all of it. Zeus growled low in his throat, his body tense, and Greg could feel the weight of the moment settling in. This was no longer just about Kate. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. "What is this?" Greg demanded again, his voice rising. "What's really going on here?" Dr. Lane looked up at Greg, his eyes filled with something darker than fear. "It's not just drugs," he said softly. "This is the next step. Biological weapons. Prototypes for new deadly pathogens. Military-grade viruses that can be released with just a few simple doses." Greg's blood ran cold. "Bioweapons?" he echoed. "You've been smuggling bioweapons through this hospital?" Dr. Lane nodded slowly, his expression resigned. "It was never about the drugs, officer. Those were just the cover. The real deal is much more dangerous. They've been using this hospital, among others, as a testing ground. And you've already uncovered it. Your partner, Kate, she was getting too close." The revelation hit Greg like a punch to the gut. He had always trusted Kate's instincts, and now it was clear that she had been right all along. The operation they had uncovered at the airport wasn't just a drug smuggling ring. It was part of something far larger, more insidious. "We need to get out of here," Greg said, his voice hard with resolve. He turned to Dr. Lane, ready to make an arrest, but before he could move, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. Greg spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder. But it wasn't just one person approaching. It was a group of men in dark suits, their faces obscured by the shadows. "It's too late," Dr. Lane said, his voice cold. "Now." They've already seen you. They know what you found. Greg didn't hesitate. Zeus, stay close, he commanded. As the men closed in, Greg and Zeus prepared for the fight ahead. This wasn't just a hospital anymore. It was ground zero for something much more dangerous. And as the first man entered the room, Greg knew that the real battle was only just beginning.